And a lot of you come to New York and come and you see everything that's really visible, and you don't really see us. You don't see our communities, and you don't see how these issues are affecting our community. So I think that Nova and Anthu did an excellent job in really creating a picture for you so that you could see what the challenges are in a place like New York City. We know that in the next 10 years there's a projected increase in population of over 1 million people. 1 million more people in New York City means more energy, means more water, more waste, more of everything, more of a taxing on an old infrastructure that is old and getting older and is already laden with a lot of the environmental problems that were described here today. And so what does that mean for communities of color and low-income communities? And we say communities of color first, because if you live in a community of color, regardless of income, the chances are greater that you're living next to environmental burdens. And so people often think that it's low-income communities and that it affects everyone the same way. But that's not true for communities of color in New York City, and it's not true for communities of color anywhere in the United States. If you live in LA and you live in what's called Black Hollywood, you're living next to environmental abuses, even though you've got one of those cribs you see on MTV. Because really, race is one of the most deciding determinants of whether or not you're living next to environmental burdens in the United States. We talked early on about what environmental justice is and it isn't, and so we spent a lot of time talking about the disparate impact of environmental burdens in our communities, the fact that our communities are the reluctant hosts to all of the infrastructure, all of the pollution, all of the manufacturing, all of the siting that is basically discriminatory. But what we didn't talk about was about leadership, that environmental justice also speaks to the fact that we speak for ourselves, that we determine what remediation is going to look like, what green jobs look like, that we are supposed to be the driving force on the ground, and we work locally, we work citywide, statewide, and nationally, and what we are part of a movement. And so we are accountable to a base, we are accountable to each other, and how we leverage power and how we're able to bring in resources and information in a very localized way is by the sharing of information. So for example, in the community that my organization is in, which is in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, which is one neighborhood of 125,000 people living next to the waterfront with 1,200 manufacturers, which has a potential of sea level rise of a storm surge in the next 10 years, all right? With power plants on the waterfront, brownfields on the waterfront. We are the largest significant maritime industrial area in New York City. What that means is that not only the chemicals that Anthu referred to that are on the ground will come into the community, but all of the chemicals being used by the manufacturers that have not been monitored will also be spilled into the community. So that's a community that is largely immigrant, largely working class. It's a walk-to-work community. Everybody walks there, right? So the solutions can't be imposed to communities that are struggling to make ends meet, people who work 2 or 3 jobs and come home and at the last thing they want to do at the end of the day is come to a meeting. How do you engage people who are struggling in environmental remediation? And how do people from the outside come in and determine what that agenda is? And we say that you don't. That you basically work respectfully to leverage power and to make sure that we have the resources necessary so that we can do it ourselves. And what's happened? In our community alone, we stopped the siting of a power plant. We facilitated the design of a greenway. We doubled the amount of open space. We've done some pretty transformational things. And now developers are using those successes as a way of promoting our community and displacing us. So what people are being told in our neighborhoods once they go green is that once you go green, you can no longer afford to live there, and we're going to push you out as if you don't deserve to live there in that way. So people in our neighborhoods tell us maybe we're better off without the trees. Maybe we should just keep the power plants. You have to choose between breathing and living in a place and affording to live in a place. Those are the choices that exist in New York City today. And it is exacerbated by mainstream environmentalists that then want to come into our communities and tell people how to live. So the answers and the response to how you do this really has to come from the grassroots, has to come from the people who live in these communities, who look like the people in these communities. And what's happened nationally in this country is that you see tons of, it isn't just a decision about how environmental burdens are cited in communities of color in New York. It's also about the distribution of resources and how the resources are distributed in a way that is unequitable. If a person of color is heading an institution of color, they get a disparate share of the funding that is distributed nationally. So you see these big organizations who have this green agenda that really has nothing to do with us, talking about fossil fuels and cap and trade, turning fossil fuels into a commodity, turning pollution into a commodity, and then, by the way, with these offset programs, doesn't address anything with siting. So what that means is that they can continue to get paid for polluting, and facilities will still be sited in low-income communities and communities of color. So we don't just look at carbon, because carbon is something that affects everyone across the board. We look at things called co-pollutants, the NOx, the SOx, the carbon monoxide, the VOCs, the things that our people, that my father at the age of 50 died of an asthma attack in the South Bronx, the things that are getting lodged in the narrow air passages of our children. So what it looks like when we talk about environmental justice is a very different kind of thing. It has to do not just with the siting decisions, but who's making the decisions and how communities have access to resources so that they can be the drivers of these processes, these things that we're doing in our communities to reclaim them. You've heard a lot about green jobs. And what you don't hear about green jobs is, again, this is a way, it's sort of like a new version of a 70s anti-poverty program where what we're doing is we're creating these blue-collar jobs and calling them green. We don't want our young people to be tracked into entry-level jobs. In our organization, our young people have air monitors where they measure the level of NOx, SOx, and carbon monoxide. They do air monitoring. They learn the nexus between math, science, and justice. We want them to be the engineers, the scientists, the educators, the people who are elected to represent their communities. We don't want them to be at the entrance serving communities that have gentrified our community and making it green so that they can breathe a little deeper. In communities like East New York, for example, they do things like urban farms, but nobody says that those institutions were created by gentrifiers who decided they wanted to eat better. And so they hired our children. So you look at it all and it looks very good, right? We say, okay, that's wonderful. We're having all these environmental things happening in our communities. But one of the biggest challenges for us, and for women in particular, because in New York and across the country, most of the environmental justice movement is led by women. One of the biggest challenges is the fact that people refuse to give up privilege. That they really want to be the people who decide for our communities what's in their best interest. We call them contemporary missionaries. And that does really get in the way of how we do the work. The best relationships are the relationships where we could work with people in a way where there are principles of collaboration and they could share expertise, and we can work in a way that is collective and respectful of the grassroots. And what we've seen happen when that happens is that we start talking about things like bioswales, and we start talking about how we treat stormwater management. And all of a sudden the language, the lexicon is in the hands of the people who live in the communities, and they feel ownership over it. They feel ownership over it in the same way that we felt ownership over civil rights. People in our communities need to understand, if they're going to understand climate change, that climate change is so essential to their survival that they need to know that. They understood civil rights. They knew when their rights were being taken away from them, and they knew how to fight for that. And this is the civil rights movement of our time. So people in our community can't think about climate change in terms of trees. They need to know that the trees are the lungs of the community, and if they plant them, they are going to reduce the level of toxins that their children are breathing in. They need to be able to make the connection between public health and environmental amenities and reclaiming these spaces. And they can't do that if those decisions are being made for them or people are telling them this is in your best interest. Recently, I'm going to tell the story. I was at a nail salon in Brooklyn, and there were two women. There were two groups of women. There was a group of white young women and a group of elderly black women. And the white women came in talking about how they were building all these bike paths and how great this was and how their children were really enjoying it. And the black women said, who asked you if that was something we wanted? Nobody asked us if we wanted that. We've been living in this community for 70 years and nobody asked us if that was a priority in our community. The white women responded, and I'm sitting there as a Latina watching the show. right? I'm sitting back saying, uh-oh, it's on now in Brooklyn, right? It's on. And the white women turn around and say, it's in your best interest. It's good for you. And I was like, oh no. Oh no, she did it now. The black women turn around and say, what? Who are you to tell me what's in my best interest? The lesson of that story, because it was a lesson about planning, it was a lesson about gentrification, it was a lesson about community engagement, was that if there had been a process that had engaged community in a meaningful way, people who were impacted, it's possible that the African American women would have said, you know what, we want the bike path, but we also want these other things. How do we make it work so that so that there's consensus and everybody gets what they need? But it was a very top-down, very imperious, very exclusive imposition on a community that has been there for a very long time. And so, so what happened is that people who might have embraced an idea that was a good one rejected it. And they rejected it because they were not at the table when the decisions were being made. And so this work that we do will not resonate with the most impacted people unless they are at the table and they are provided the tools and the resources to engage in a way that's meaningful. And meaningful doesn't mean that you have this great idea and you come and you say, hey, this is a great idea, and then people support that idea. It's, let's talk about what you want, and let's figure out how we get the resources and what are the priorities, the community priorities. And you'll find that at the end, like what happened in our community. In our community, we had a group of Asian women who didn't speak English, with a group of Latinas who didn't speak English, all communicating with each other about what they wanted the Greenway to look like. The coolest thing. The coolest thing. And they knew what they wanted. Our responsibility was to sit in the back, facilitate the process, provide them with the information, with the maps, with the tools that they needed so that they could envision and plan something that they felt ownership of. So climate is something so serious, so timely, so urgent, that we cannot afford to ignore the process of how we engage people of color in a way that is meaningful. And that is a serious challenge all over New York City, where people just sort of think that, you know, we got you, we can do this for you. But I tell them, this is not the 70s anymore. You know, some of us went away to school. We come out of that struggle. We come out of Nova's struggle. But some of us went away and went to school and came back. And we've got degrees. And you know, it's a different time. So I share that with you because often when we think about environmental justice and we think about climate justice, we think about the impacts. And we don't think about the process. And the process is a very powerful, transformational thing. Our young people, our organization is intergenerational. We have young people on our staff, on our board of directors. We believe that you don't have a community unless it's intergenerational. We believe that young people don't have to wait to exercise leadership. But we also believe that we need to provide them with the information and the training they need in order to exercise leadership in a way that's responsible and meaningful. So young people are an important piece, and they are sort of, because in this country, there's this Anglo-American construct that things are either youth-led or adult-led. You know, older people are pushed out in this country and treated like they have nothing of value to add. At the same time, young people are silenced. There's a schizophrenia with age in this country, which doesn't exist in Latin America, in Africa, in other countries where people work together as community, and there's a place for elders, and there's a place for young people. And so we're saying that leadership has to be a continuum, and that there are different places in your life based on your experience where you can exercise that, but that the table is not set unless everybody is at that table. And so our environmental justice organizer is 23 years old, and he started at UPROSE when he was 10. So people don't leave. He just spoke at the United Nations recently. One of our youth leaders just came back from the South Pole. She went to a scientific expedition where she represented the borough of Brooklyn and went to talk about the impacts of climate change on the urban environment. This is a child that had never left her neighborhood. All right? So they are doing some really powerful things because we don't think our young people are at risk. We think they're at potential. And we think that because we were them. And there was a time in our life when we were told that we couldn't do those things, that we couldn't go to college, that we couldn't go to law school, that we were at risk. And we had to believe we could do these things. But it had to come from inside because there was nothing that was being given to us educationally or institutionally to support us, right? So These spaces have to be created in a way that's really intentional. Our elders need to be paid attention to. We need to make sure the population is getting much older in the United States and in New York in particular. What's happened in New York, let me just tell you what's going on. So in New York City, one of the cool things about New York City is that you can leave your